Nobody talks about how this single sentence destroyed Germany and created Hitler. Here's the real story. The Treaty of Versailles gets blamed for a lot of things. People say it was too harsh. They say it humiliated Germany. But most people have no idea what actually made Germans so angry that they were willing to follow a madman into another world war. It wasn't just about losing territory. It wasn't just about paying money. It was about these 7 words. Germany accepts responsibility for causing all loss and damage. That's it. That's the clause. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. 7 words that would reshape the entire 20th century. 7 words that would lead directly to Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, and the deaths of more people than any other event in human history. And the worst part? The people who wrote these words had no idea what they were doing. They thought they were just creating a legal justification for reparations. Instead, they created the most effective piece of enemy propaganda ever written. Let me take you back to 1919. World War I has just ended. 16 million people are dead. Europe is destroyed. Entire generations have been wiped out in the trenches. The world wants someone to blame. They want justice. They want to make sure this never happens again. And they're all looking at Germany. Now, here's where things get complicated. Did Germany start World War I? That's a much harder question than most people realize. Yes, Germany invaded Belgium and France. Yes, Germany had aggressive war plans. But Austria-Hungary actually started the war by invading Serbia. Russia was the first major power to mobilize its armies. France was eager to fight to recover territory lost in 1870. Britain had been worried about German naval power for years. Every major European power shares some blame for how a regional crisis in the Balkans turned into a world war. But that's not what the Treaty of Versailles says. The treaty says Germany and its allies are responsible for causing all the loss and damage. Not some of it, all of it. Every death, every destroyed building, every widow and orphan, every economic loss, everything was Germany's fault. Why would the Allies write something so extreme? Because they needed a legal justification for reparations. If Germany caused the war, then Germany should pay for the war. Simple logic, right? But the consequences of this logic would be anything but simple. The war guilt clause wasn't even supposed to be the important part of the treaty. It was just the legal foundation for the reparations section that followed. The diplomats who drafted it probably spent more time arguing about what to have for lunch than they did thinking about the long-term implications of Article 231. They were lawyers, thinking about legal precedent. They weren't thinking about how this would play in German politics for the next 20 years. When the German delegation saw the treaty for the first time in May 1919, they were shocked. Remember, Germany had surrendered based on President Wilson's 14 points. These were principles that promised a fair peace, self-determination, and a new world order based on justice rather than revenge. The Germans expected negotiations. What they got was a document shoved across the table with a simple message: sign this or we invade. The German foreign minister, Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, read Article 231 and understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't just about money. This was about honor. This was about history. This was about how Germans would see themselves and how the world would see Germany for generations to come. He refused to sign. The German government sent desperate messages to the Allies begging them to reconsider. They offered counterproposals. They argued that the clause was historically inaccurate and morally wrong. The Allies didn't care. They made a few tiny modifications to other parts of the treaty, nothing substantial, and then issued an ultimatum: sign within 5 days or the invasion begins. The German government had no choice. The military was in no condition to fight. The country was starving because of the Allied blockade. Revolution was spreading across Germany. On June 28, 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. But they made sure to state publicly that they were signing under protest, that they rejected the war guilt clause, and that they considered the entire treaty to be illegitimate. That last part is crucial. From day one, most Germans saw the Treaty of Versailles as something imposed by force, not a legitimate peace agreement. And the war guilt clause was the part they hated most. It became known in Germany as the Kriegsschuldlüge, the war guilt lie. German historians, politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens spent the next decade arguing that Germany had not caused the war. They published books and articles. They held conferences. They created research institutes dedicated to proving that Article 231 was false. And here's the thing. They had a point. The causes of World War I were complex. Blaming everything on Germany and its allies was historically simplistic and politically motivated. But the Allies didn't care about historical nuance. They needed someone to pay for the war, and Germany had lost, so Germany would pay. The practical consequences of the war guilt clause came in the form of reparations. Because Germany had caused all the damage, Germany had to pay for all the damage. How much? The treaty didn't say. Instead, a reparations commission would determine the final amount later. This was intentional. If the Allies had put a specific number in the treaty, it might have seemed so outrageous that Germany would refuse to sign, even under threat of invasion. By leaving it vague, they could force Germany to accept the principle of reparations first, and then present the bill later. In 1921, the bill arrived. 132 billion gold marks. That's about 33 billion US dollars at 1921 exchange rates, or roughly 500 billion in today's money. To put that in perspective, that was about 3 times Germany's entire annual economic output. Imagine if someone told you personally that you had to pay 3 times your annual salary every single year for the next several decades. That's what the Allies demanded from Germany. And it was all justified by those 7 words in Article 231. The German public was furious. The government that had signed the treaty, the Weimar Republic, was immediately associated with this humiliation. Right-wing politicians started calling them the November criminals, accusing them of betraying Germany. It didn't matter that the government had signed under duress, that they had no real choice. In the minds of many Germans, the democratic government was illegitimate, because it had accepted the war guilt lie and agreed to pay reparations. This created a poisonous political environment. The Weimar Republic was trying to function as a democracy in a country where a huge portion of the population rejected its legitimacy. And hovering over every political debate, every economic crisis, every foreign policy decision was Article 231, the war guilt lie. The national humiliation that could never be forgotten or forgiven. But the war guilt clause didn't just damage German politics, it also destroyed any chance of Germans accepting moral responsibility for the war. This might sound like a contradiction, but it's actually crucial to understanding what happened. If the treaty had assigned Germany a share of the blame, maybe 50% or even 70%, Germans might have been able to accept that. Germany had made mistakes. The invasion of Belgium had been wrong. German militarism had contributed to the war. A fair accounting of blame might have allowed for a productive discussion about what Germany had done wrong. Instead, by claiming that Germany was responsible for everything, the treaty made it impossible for Germans to accept any responsibility. The claim was so extreme, so obviously unfair, that it allowed Germans to reject the entire concept. They threw out the baby with the bathwater. Instead of saying Germany was partly responsible, but not solely responsible, many Germans concluded that Germany bore no responsibility at all. The war guilt lie, they argued, proved that the Allies were liars who were simply trying to destroy Germany. Therefore, nothing the Allies said could be trusted. This is how Article 231 created the conditions for what Germans called the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth. This was the idea that Germany hadn't actually lost World War I on the battlefield. Instead, the army had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews on the home front who had undermined the war effort and then surrendered when victory was within reach. This was completely false. The German army had been on the verge of collapse in 1918. But the myth was powerful because it offered an explanation for defeat that didn't require accepting that Germany had been beaten militarily. And the myth was made more believable by Article 231. After all, the myth went, if Germany had really lost the war, why did the Allies need to lie about who started it? The very existence of the war guilt lie seemed to prove that the Allies were engaged in a conspiracy to destroy Germany through propaganda and false accusations. Therefore, the stab-in-the-back myth must be true. Germany had been betrayed from within, and now it was being destroyed from without by the same forces. This kind of thinking might seem crazy to us now, but you have to understand the context. Germany in 1919 was a society in shock. They had expected to win the war. The government had told them victory was near. Then suddenly, the government was asking for an armistice. Then the Kaiser fled to Holland. Then there was a revolution. Then there was a new democratic government that nobody had asked for. Then, this government signed a treaty that said Germany had caused the war and had to pay billions in reparations and give up huge amounts of territory. For many Germans, none of this made sense unless there had been some kind of betrayal or conspiracy. The war guilt clause gave these conspiracy theories a foundation to build on. And the people who pushed these theories the hardest were the old military and political elite who actually were responsible for Germany's defeat. They used Article 231 to deflect blame from themselves and onto the democratic government, the socialists, the communists, and the Jews. This was cynical and dishonest, but it was also devastatingly effective. Among the millions of Germans who believed in the stab-in-the-back myth and who raged against the war guilt lie was a former corporal in the German army named Adolf Hitler. He had been wounded and temporarily blinded by a gas attack in 1918. He was in a hospital when he learned that Germany had surrendered. By his own account, he was devastated. He had believed in the war. He had been a good soldier. And now he was being told that it had all been for nothing. That Germany had surrendered, that the Kaiser had fled, that there was a revolution. Then there was a new democratic government that nobody had asked for. Then this government signed a treaty that said Germany had caused the war and had to pay billions in reparations and give up huge amounts of territory. For many Germans, none of this made sense unless there had been some kind of betrayal or conspiracy. The war guilt clause gave these conspiracy theories a foundation to build on. And the people who pushed these theories the hardest were the old military and political elite who actually were responsible for Germany's defeat. They used Article 231 to deflect blame from themselves and onto the democratic government, the socialists, the communists, and the Jews. This was cynical and dishonest, but it was also devastatingly effective. When Hitler read the Treaty of Versailles and saw Article 231, something broke inside him. This became his obsession, the war guilt lie, the November criminals who had signed the treaty, the international conspiracy that had destroyed Germany. From 1919 until his death in 1945, Hitler never stopped talking about the Treaty of Versailles and the injustice of the war guilt clause. It was the foundation of his entire worldview. Hitler's early speeches in the 1920s are full of references to Article 231. He would work himself into a rage describing how Germany had been stabbed in the back and then blamed for starting a war that others had caused. He promised his audiences that if they followed him, he would tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore German honor. He would refuse to pay reparations. He would recover lost territory. He would rebuild the military. He would prove that Germany had not been guilty, that Germany had been the victim, and that Germany would rise again. In the early 1920s, hardly anyone listened to Hitler. He was a fringe figure, a failed artist turned rabble-rouser in beer halls. But he was building a movement based on rage against the Treaty of Versailles, and especially against Article 231. And when economic crisis hit Germany, people started listening. The first crisis came in 1923. Germany had been struggling to pay reparations. The German government argued that the economy was too damaged to meet the payment schedule. France didn't believe them. The French thought Germany was just trying to get out of paying. So in January 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to take coal and manufactured goods by force as payment. The German government called for passive resistance. Workers went on strike. The economy ground to a halt. And because the government was still paying the striking workers, it had to print more and more money. This triggered hyperinflation. The German mark became worthless. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Life savings evaporated. The middle class was destroyed. Pensioners starved. It was an economic catastrophe. And who did Germans blame? The Treaty of Versailles. If it weren't for the war guilt clause and the reparations, France wouldn't have occupied the Ruhr. If it weren't for the reparations, the government wouldn't have needed to print money. If it weren't for Article 231, none of this would have happened. The war guilt lie had led directly to the destruction of the German economy. Hitler tried to take advantage of the chaos with the beer hall putsch in November 1923, an attempt to overthrow the government in Munich. It failed. Hitler was arrested and sent to prison, but even in prison he kept writing about the Treaty of Versailles. His book Mein Kampf, written in prison in 1924, is obsessed with Article 231 and the injustice done to Germany. He devotes entire chapters to the treaty and the war guilt lie. Reading Mein Kampf, you can see how the war guilt clause had become central to Hitler's entire understanding of history and politics. The German economy stabilized in the mid-1920s, largely thanks to American loans. For a few years, it seemed like Germany might recover. The Dawes Plan restructured reparations to make them more manageable. The Locarno treaties in 1925 seemed to offer a new era of cooperation between Germany and its former enemies. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations. Some German politicians even started talking about accepting the treaty and moving on. But the rage about Article 231 never went away. It was always there, simmering under the surface. German historians continued to publish books arguing that Germany hadn't caused the war. German politicians continued to demand revision of the treaty, and extremists like Hitler continued to build their movements on the promise of overturning Versailles and restoring German honor. Then came the Great Depression. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed. American loans to Germany dried up overnight. German exports collapsed because no one could afford to buy anything. Unemployment exploded. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. This was 30% of the workforce. The government couldn't provide adequate welfare because it was still trying to pay reparations. Banks failed, businesses closed, families lost everything. And once again, Germans blamed the Treaty of Versailles. If it weren't for reparations draining the economy, Germany might have weathered the Depression. If it weren't for the territorial losses, Germany would have more resources. If it weren't for the war guilt lie undermining German self-confidence, maybe things would be different. Article 231 became the explanation for every problem Germany faced. In this environment, Hitler's message suddenly resonated with millions of Germans. He had been saying the same thing for a decade. The Treaty of Versailles was destroying Germany. The war guilt clause was a lie. The democratic government was illegitimate because it had accepted this humiliation. Germany needed a strong leader who would tear up the treaty and make Germany powerful again. In the prosperous years of the late 1920s, this had sounded extreme. In the desperate years of the early 1930s, it sounded like salvation. The Nazi Party grew from a fringe movement to a major political force in just a few years. In 1928, they won 2.6% of the vote. In 1930, they won 18.3%. In July 1932, they won 37.3%, making them the largest party in the Reichstag. And Hitler's message throughout this rise was consistent. The Treaty of Versailles must be destroyed, the war guilt lie must be rejected, and Germany must be restored to its rightful place as a great power. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. One of his first major speeches as Chancellor was about the Treaty of Versailles. He promised the German people that he would overturn it. He promised that Germany would never again accept the humiliation of Article 231. He promised that the era of paying reparations and accepting war guilt was over, and the crowd went wild. Finally, a leader who understood their anger and who was willing to do something about it. Hitler moved quickly to destroy the Treaty of Versailles. In October 1933, he withdrew Germany from the League of Nations and from the Geneva Disarmament Conference. In 1935, he openly announced that Germany was rearming, creating an air force, and expanding the army in direct violation of the treaty. In 1936, he sent troops into the Rhineland, remilitarizing it in defiance of the treaty. Each time, he justified his actions by reference to the injustice of Versailles and the war guilt lie. Germany was simply recovering its sovereignty, he argued. Germany was rejecting the diktat that had been imposed by force. And here's the crucial thing. Many people in Britain and France agreed with him. They had come to believe that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh. They felt guilty about how Germany had been treated. They thought Article 231 had been unfair. So when Hitler began violating the treaty, they didn't stop him. They convinced themselves that he had legitimate grievances, that he was just recovering German territory, that he would be satisfied once the worst injustices of Versailles were corrected. This was the policy of appeasement, and it was based in part on a recognition that the war guilt clause and the broader treaty had been unjust. British politicians in particular kept saying that Hitler had a point, that Germany had been treated unfairly, that some revision of the treaty was reasonable. They didn't understand that for Hitler, there was no such thing as limited revision. He didn't just want to modify Article 231. He wanted to prove that it was a lie by making Germany so powerful that no one would dare to claim Germany had been guilty of anything. Every time Hitler got away with violating the treaty, he became bolder. In 1938, he annexed Austria, specifically forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France did nothing. Later in 1938, he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. At the Munich conference, Britain and France gave it to him, hoping this would be enough. It wasn't. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now Britain and France finally realized that appeasement had failed, that Hitler couldn't be satisfied. When he made demands on Poland, they drew a line. If Hitler attacked Poland, there would be war. On September 1, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. World War II had begun. And if you read Hitler's speeches and writings from this period, he's still talking about the Treaty of Versailles. He's still talking about Article 231. He's still justifying his actions as a response to the injustice done to Germany in 1919. The war guilt lie hadn't just helped bring Hitler to power. It continued to shape his thinking and his actions even as he launched the most destructive war in human history. Now, you might be thinking, surely Hitler would have been dangerous regardless of Article 231. Maybe he would have found some other grievance to exploit. And you're probably right. Hitler was a deeply disturbed individual whose worldview was built on racism, nationalism, and a desire for conquest. The Treaty of Versailles didn't create Hitler's anti-Semitism or his belief in German racial superiority. But here's what the War Guilt Clause did do. It gave Hitler credibility. It gave him a legitimate grievance that millions of ordinary Germans shared. It allowed him to position himself not as a dangerous extremist, but as a patriotic German standing up for his country's honor. It provided cover for his aggressive foreign policy in the 1930s, and it helped him build a mass movement by tapping into genuine anger and humiliation that most Germans felt. Without Article 231, Hitler might have remained a fringe figure, ranting in beer halls. The War Guilt Clause didn't make Hitler evil, but it made him effective. It gave him a weapon that he used to destroy German democracy, to radicalize German politics, and ultimately to drag the world into another war. And the irony is that the men who wrote Article 231 weren't trying to start another war, they were trying to prevent one. They thought that if Germany accepted responsibility for World War I and paid for the damage, Germany would be too weak to threaten anyone again. They thought they were creating the legal foundation for a just peace. Instead, they created the foundation for Nazi propaganda. This is one of the great lessons of the War Guilt Clause. Good intentions don't guarantee good results. The Allied leaders in 1919 wanted to create a lasting peace. They wanted justice for the millions who had died. They wanted security for their nations. These were not evil goals. But the method they chose, the assignment of total war guilt to Germany and its allies, was so unjust and so politically tone-deaf that it undermined everything they were trying to achieve. The War Guilt Clause was supposed to make Germany accept responsibility for the war. Instead, it made Germans reject all responsibility. It was supposed to provide a legal basis for reparations. Instead, it made reparations seem like theft. It was supposed to humble Germany. Instead, it radicalized Germany. Every single thing that Article 231 was meant to accomplish, it accomplished the opposite. Could it have been different? Absolutely. Imagine if the treaty had said something like, all the major powers share responsibility for the outbreak of the war, but Germany, as one of the Central Powers and having invaded Belgium, must bear a significant share of that responsibility and therefore contribute to reconstruction. That would still have allowed for reparations, but it would have been historically more accurate and politically more acceptable to Germans. Germans might still have resented it, but they couldn't have claimed it was a complete lie. Or imagine if the treaty had avoided the whole question of war guilt and simply said that as the defeated power, Germany had to contribute to reconstruction without any moral judgment about who started the war. This might have been more palatable because it wouldn't have been about honor and history, just the practical reality of defeat. But the Allies didn't do this. They insisted on total war guilt. They needed Germany to be the villain, completely and totally responsible, so they could justify the harsh terms of the treaty. And in doing so, they created a grievance so powerful that it helped destroy German democracy and pave the way for Hitler. The effects of the War Guilt Clause extended far beyond Germany. It poisoned international relations for 2 decades. It made revision of the treaty nearly impossible because Germany's position was always that the entire treaty was based on a lie. How do you negotiate with someone when the starting point is a fundamental disagreement about historical truth? France and Britain wanted Germany to fulfill the treaty. Germany wanted to overturn it. There was no middle ground because Article 231 made the entire treaty seem illegitimate to Germans. The War Guilt Clause also contributed to the failure of the League of Nations. Germany was initially excluded from the League, in part because of its war guilt. When Germany was finally admitted in 1926, German representatives never stopped arguing about Article 231 and demanding revision of the treaty. This made cooperation difficult. And when Hitler withdrew Germany from the League in 1933, he justified it by reference to the unfair treatment Germany had received, including the war guilt lie. The League's legitimacy in German eyes was always undermined by Article 231. Even the strategic situation in Europe was shaped by the war guilt clause. The territorial provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the creation of the Polish corridor and the separation of East Prussia from the rest of Germany, were deeply unpopular with Germans. But they might have been accepted if the overall treaty had been seen as fair. Because Article 231 made the entire treaty seem illegitimate, every territorial loss became a grievance that must be overturned. Hitler's demands for Lebensraum, living space in the East, were in part a continuation of resentment about the territorial losses imposed by a treaty based on the war guilt lie. The clause even shaped military thinking. German military leaders in the 1930s were determined to avoid the mistakes they believed had led to defeat in World War I. But because many of them believed in the stab-in-the-back myth, they misidentified what those mistakes had been. They thought Germany had lost because of internal weakness and betrayal, not because of strategic errors. This led them to focus on preventing internal dissent and creating a totalitarian state rather than on learning the actual military lessons of the First World War. The war guilt lie, by obscuring the real reasons for German defeat, helped lead German military thinking down a disastrous path. And of course, the war guilt clause helped create the ideological framework for the Holocaust. This requires some explanation. Hitler's anti-Semitism wasn't caused by Article 231. He was already an anti-Semite before World War I ended. But the war guilt lie and the stab-in-the-back myth became intertwined with anti-Semitism in Nazi ideology. The Nazis claimed that it was Jews who had stabbed Germany in the back during the war, that Jews had created the Weimar Republic, that Jews had forced Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and that Jews had invented the war guilt lie to destroy Germany. This conspiracy theory made the Jews responsible for Germany's humiliation. Therefore, in the twisted logic of Nazi ideology, destroying the Jews would allow Germany to recover from the humiliation of Versailles. The Holocaust was about many things, but one element was the Nazi belief that they were taking revenge on those responsible for the war guilt lie and the Treaty of Versailles. When Hitler spoke about exterminating the Jews, he often connected it to the Treaty of Versailles and the injustices done to Germany after World War I. Article 231 didn't cause the Holocaust, but it became part of the ideological justification for it. After World War II, the Allies learned from the mistakes of Versailles. There was no war guilt clause in the peace settlement after 1945. Germany was occupied and divided, but there was no treaty assigning total responsibility for the war. Everyone knew that Nazi Germany had started World War II, but there was no need to enshrine it in a legal document that would poison politics for decades. Instead, the focus was on rehabilitation and integration. The Marshall Plan provided billions of dollars to rebuild Europe, including the parts of Germany controlled by the Western Allies. Former enemies were brought into new international institutions like NATO and what would become the European Union. War criminals were prosecuted at Nuremberg, but the German people as a whole were not held collectively responsible. This approach worked. Germany became a stable democracy and a reliable ally. There was no mass movement demanding revenge or revision of the peace settlement after World War II. German politicians across the political spectrum accepted Germany's responsibility for World War II. The bitter resentments that had poisoned German politics after World War I did not reappear after World War II. Why did this work when Versailles had failed? Partly because Germany was occupied and couldn't reject the settlement, partly because the division of Germany into East and West meant neither German state could dream of becoming a great power again, but also because there was no equivalent of Article 231 poisoning the well. Germans could accept that Nazi Germany had started the war without feeling that they were accepting a lie or a humiliation. The absence of a war guilt clause made acceptance of defeat possible. This is the final irony of Article 231. The clause that was meant to make Germans accept responsibility instead made them reject it. And when Germany finally did accept responsibility for starting a war, it was for World War II, and there was no formal war guilt clause at all. The Allies in 1945 achieved what the Allies in 1919 had failed to achieve, partly by not trying to force a legal admission of guilt.
Third, that humiliation is a dangerous tool in international relations. The war guilt clause was meant to humble Germany. It succeeded. But humiliation breeds resentment, and resentment breeds extremism. The Allies in 1919 were so focused on punishing Germany that they didn't think about the long-term consequences of that punishment. They created a Germany that was weak enough to resent its treatment, but strong enough to eventually seek revenge. Fourth, that legitimacy matters more than force. The Treaty of Versailles was imposed by force. Germany signed it under threat of invasion, but force can only sustain a settlement for so long. Eventually, the defeated power will recover, and if they see the settlement as illegitimate, they will try to overturn it. The war guilt clause ensured that most Germans saw Versailles as illegitimate from the start. This meant that as soon as Germany recovered enough strength, it would challenge the treaty. And when Hitler came to power promising to destroy Versailles, he was tapping into a sentiment that the war guilt clause had created. Fifth, that justice matters. The Treaty of Versailles was not a just settlement. Article 231 was not a fair or accurate assessment of responsibility for the war, and because it was unjust, it could not last. Just settlements can endure because the people living under them accept their legitimacy. Unjust settlements are always vulnerable to challenge. The war guilt clause made the entire Treaty of Versailles seem unjust to Germans, and that perception ultimately destroyed the post-World War I order. The 7 words of Article 231 demonstrate how a single bad decision in a peace treaty can have cascading consequences over decades. The men who wrote those words in 1919 were trying to create a foundation for lasting peace. Instead, they created a foundation for renewed war. They thought they were dealing with the past. They didn't realize they were shaping the future. World War II killed approximately 60 million people. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. The atomic bomb was used for the first and only time in warfare. The world was divided into hostile camps for nearly 50 years. All of this had many causes, but one of those causes, impossible to quantify but undeniable in its importance, was 7 words in a peace treaty. Germany accepts responsibility for causing all loss and damage. These weren't the only 7 words that mattered in 20th century history, but they might have been the most destructive. They helped create Adolf Hitler. They helped destroy German democracy. They helped make another war inevitable. 7 words. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, the lie that killed 60 million people. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919. As the German representatives put their signatures on the document, including Article 231, they could not have known that they were signing the death warrants of millions of people not yet born. They could not have known that those 7 words would reverberate through history, shaping events for decades to come. They could not have known that in trying to end one war, they were planting the seeds of another, far more terrible conflict. But the Allied leaders who drafted Article 231 should have known better. They should have understood that humiliation and injustice do not create lasting peace. They should have recognized that a settlement seen as illegitimate by one of the major powers would not endure.
They should have realized that assigning total war guilt to Germany would poison German politics and make reconciliation impossible. They didn't, and the world paid the price. 60 million dead, the price of 7 words. Subscribe to learn what they don't teach you in history class.